Jesus Christ tells a parable about two men who built two houses. You should know this parable by now, I would imagine. One man builds a house on a firm foundation of rock. The other builds his house on sand. The house built on rock, of course, stands firm when the storms and the rain come, but the house built on sand totally collapses. Now, the meaning is pretty obvious. The houses are Christian communities. The house built on rock is the one holy Catholic and apostolic church built on the foundation of Christ, Peter, and the apostles. The sand is man's own ideas, and those houses are heresies and false religions. But maybe there's another way to interpret this parable. See, the houses can be more than heresies or churches. They can be our own personal faith. And yes, of course, we must build our faith on an authentic relationship with Jesus and his church. But what else is important to build it on? The guy we're going to talk about today called himself Desiderius Erasmus, and he lived during the 15th and 16th centuries, around the same time as Luther, Wycliffe, Zwingli, Henry VIII, and other key figures of the Protestant Revolt. But Erasmus wasn't the founder of a Protestant heresy. He wasn't even really a Protestant. He was something far worse. Let's talk some history to understand this. As we've said before, Europe and the church were in a mess. We've talked about clerical corruption and how it scandalized many of the faithful, but there were two other related movements that impacted the Protestant Revolt. These were the Renaissance and Humanism. The Renaissance was a great flowering of learning and art. Many of the artists and scientists of this era, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, are well known to us today, and you can still see the beautiful paintings, sculptures, and buildings they made, as well as the use of science they helped found. The Renaissance was driven by princes and dukes and merchants with a lot of money who wanted to show off their wealth and sophistication. They were patrons to the artists, and it was a time of great beauty and learning. Some of the most wonderful pieces of Catholic art were made during this period, as the popes were great supporters of Renaissance artists. But there was a darker side to the Renaissance. The new money and knowledge and art spread throughout society. Previously, it had been Catholic, focused on the church, but now it became more secular. This led to a materialistic society. People wanted pleasures and riches. Think Wall Street, but with less power ties and more silly hats. Not only did this focus on worldly wealth push Catholic morality aside, it also destroyed interest in the supernatural. Humanism, a focus on man and the world rather than God and the supernatural, grew, and the stage was set for a dreadful revolt. The man who called himself Erasmus wasn't the founder of humanism, but he is the most famous humanist and can be considered the spiritual father of the Protestant Revolt. He was born in Rotterdam in Holland around the year 1466. We don't know his real name, but he later on called himself Desiderius Erasmus. He was the illegitimate child of a man who later became a priest, and his mother brought him up on her own. He started his education under a man called Hedges. I think that, at least, was his real name. Even as a child, Erasmus, or whatever he was calling himself, was highly intelligent, blessed with an excellent memory, and very quick on the uptake. Exposed to humanism by his teacher, Erasmus fell in love with it, and it proved to be the guiding philosophy of his life. His mother died when he was still a child, and he spent 2 years in a monastery school. This might have been an opportunity for him to reject the false philosophy of humanism and embrace the truth, but he didn't take it. Later on, he called his time at the monastery lost years. In 1486, when he was around 20 years old, he entered a house of canons regular. He said he was forced to by his guardians and didn't feel a vocation to religious life. Still, this allowed him to continue his studies. He read and learned even more, devoting himself to the ancient classics. It's perhaps easy to see how he ended up like he did. Not going about with a false name, although maybe it makes sense he wanted to reinvent himself. But living a life indifferent to religion and supernaturalism, he had an unhappy childhood, was forced to go to the monastery school and then join the canons. He was fiercely intelligent, but lacked love and direction. He certainly never applied himself to really learning who Christ was or establishing a loving relationship with Jesus. His faith was always very rational, very academic, very cold-blooded. But as I said, he was very clever and very well educated. In 1492, his brilliance at languages attracted the attention of a bishop who ordained him a priest. Remember, this was a man who said he had no particular religious vocation. Erasmus, if that is your real name, worked as the bishop's secretary for several years before he was sent to Paris in 1496 to continue his studies. At this point in history, the main style of education was scholastic method. This involves discussion, rigorous analysis, and the careful drawing of precise distinctions. Erasmus didn't like it. He actually hated it so much he stopped attending classes. He thought it split hairs and made people have ridiculous arguments about mysteries that couldn't be understood. He thought it silly to talk about the Trinity, baptism, original sin, and a whole host of other complicated and mysterious doctrines. Of course, in Catholic theology, the word mystery doesn't mean something a Great Dane and 4 teenagers in a Volkswagen camper van discover was just Old Man Winchester in a mask all along. Nor does it mean something we can't understand. It comes from the word mystical and means something we can't understand unless it's revealed by God. Well, these things have been revealed by God. That's what revelation, scripture, and tradition is for. Pure rationalism can't reveal them. Scholasticism doesn't reveal these things, but it helps us to understand them better. A good example of this would be the Eucharist. Divine revelation tells us that it is Jesus Christ, but scholasticism allowed the Council of Trent to convey the precise doctrine of transubstantiation. But Erasmus didn't have any time for that sort of thing. Instead, he wandered around Europe for several years, supporting himself financially by teaching. He hung out with all kinds of well-known people, priests, bishops, professors, even kings, cardinals, and a future pope. And some saints, too. You have to understand, Erasmus was brilliant. This was why people spent time with him and why he was so highly regarded. He was incredibly intelligent, educated in a wide variety of subjects, an excellent writer, and a wonderful speaker. The phrase Renaissance man could have been invented for him. It doesn't just mean a guy who was alive during the Renaissance, but rather someone who was skilled at many different things. But there was a darker side to this. He knew he was brilliant. This made him vain, complacent, and indifferent to religion. His humor and wit were often sarcastic and cruel. Although he had knowledge of many different things, it wasn't thorough or in-depth. It was as if he thought himself so much better, so much more intelligent than other people and even the church, that he didn't need to bother. His notion of salvation was something he called the philosophy of Christ, but it really had nothing to do with Jesus. It was a purely natural, not supernatural, ethical ideal that came from human wisdom. Of course, if all we are doing is trying to be good people according to some human ideal, then Christian morality, which is supernatural and comes from God, not man, is set aside. Erasmus called pagan poets like Virgil and Horace saints without a drop of irony. To him, these men were saints because of their intellect-driven ethics. He rejected many of the church's doctrines. You'd likely recognize the list as being similar to those the great rebels such as Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli rejected. The primacy of the Pope, confession, the permanence of marriage, fasts, pilgrimages, celibacy, and veneration of saints. He analyzed the scriptures with a cold rationalism, treating the biblical narrative as if it were ancient myths, interpreting them as figurative rather than historical. While traveling around Europe, he wrote a number of books. Most of them were scholarly works, a primer on how to learn Latin, commentaries on the scripture, that kind of thing. But they invariably included sarcastic attacks on the church and monastic life. And this, his cruel sarcasm, his philosophical rejection of the church's tradition, without really understanding it, made him the spiritual father of the Reformation. But he didn't have any desire to be a revolutionary. Unlike leaders like Luther and Zwingli, Erasmus didn't want to convert the common man. He was too intellectual, too impractical. To him, it was all about high-minded discussion with refined and educated people rather than something that might change lives. He just came up with his ideas and threw them out there, not really caring what damage they did or what the logical end result of it all might be. Maybe it's not really fair, but I just can't help it but to imagine him like a bored college student taking a year off or 3 to go bum around Europe for a while. He's got some education and he's convinced he knows so much better than all those squares and his parents and all those stuffy priests. He's got a head full of new philosophy and hasn't really thought it through. He's certainly intelligent, but he's content to ride on his natural gifts rather than apply himself thoroughly to learning. He spouts his ideas at coffee bars and his blog, but doesn't seem to take them to their logical conclusion. To him, it's just a fun intellectual distraction. But he doesn't seem aware his ideas have any practical consequences. That was certainly true for Erasmus. Although his ideas were adopted by men like Luther, he soon fell out of favor with them. Luther especially became fed up with his impracticality and what Luther, recognized as a failure of Christianity. "My liking for Erasmus declined from day to day," he said. "The human is of more value to him than the divine. The times are now dangerous, and I see that a man is not a more sincere or a wiser Christian for all that he is a good Greek or Hebrew scholar." Perhaps part of the reason Luther didn't like him was the way he seemed to flip-flop and be wishy-washy. Erasmus opposed any persecution of Luther, and when the German was excommunicated, he said that it was wrong. But at the same time, he distanced himself from Luther, saying he wasn't associated in any way with him, claiming a complete ignorance of his writings. This, of course, from one of the most widely read men in Europe at the time. He claimed, despite his sarcastic attacks on the church and her doctrines, he submitted completely to the Pope. He called for a nice, pleasant dialogue between heretics and the church, right in the middle of the Europe-wide revolt that was the Protestant Reformation, when the church and her sacraments were under attack from all sides. This sometimes backfired, as his attempts at peacemaking and neutrality was seen as trying to be on both sides at once. It is not hard to see all of this in a similar way to so many of the oh-so-clever theologians of today who debate very nicely using weasel words to suggest something against the church, while at the same time hiding behind a technical interpretation which just so happens to be orthodox. And like many of these quisling theologians, he was never excommunicated. His health failed, and while traveling to the Netherlands, he died of dysentery in Switzerland. He left behind a legacy that is obvious. Although not the founder of humanism, he was one of its greatest champions. So much of the modern rejection of the supernatural in Protestant Christianity, and even within the church, can be laid at the feet of Erasmus. The idea that Christ's miracles aren't really miracles, but just explanations for people too foolish for science. Or that creation story is nothing more than a myth and God didn't really make the universe. These are the fruits of Erasmus's humanism. And of course, he was the spiritual and intellectual father of the Protestant Revolt. What he did intellectually with his writings, men like Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin did practically with their rebellion. So, what can we learn from the example of Erasmus? Well, there are two things. First, and perhaps foremost, apply yourself. The Catholic faith isn't just some thought exercise, a series of ideas to be discussed and not put into practice. It has real-world implications. Right now, this very hour, minute, and second, the faith is under attack. And it's perhaps the worst attack since the Protestant Revolt, maybe even worse than that. The secular world hates the faith and wants to see her destroyed. Satan has powerful allies in governments, businesses, and in the media, and he has useful idiots, and maybe even willing accomplices inside the church too. All of these people want to destroy the faith, to break the church and reduce her to a weak, sideline force so she can't convert the world. It's not a thought exercise to these people. It's a very real, practical war, and they, sad to say, are winning it. Don't just stand idly by. It's not enough to just know this stuff. You have to live it. Get out there and fight for the church. But secondly, the faith isn't an intellectual exercise. It is an exercise in love. When we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, he won't ask us how much we knew. He'll ask us how much we loved. Did we feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick? Did we instruct the ignorant, console the afflicted, admonish the sinner? Is our faith just a cold-minded, bloodless intellectualism? That's the trap Erasmus fell into, losing sight of love and turning the faith into nothing more than an intellectual exercise that he never really fought for on either side. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. That's all for this time. Next time, we're staying in the country where Erasmus died, Switzerland, and we'll be talking about Heydrich Zwingli. Until then, stay holy, stay Catholic, and keep on loving. I'm Charles Hornbacher, and this has been Houses Built on Sand.